Good evening, one and all. We welcome you all to the International Webinar Series on Holistic Health, Well-being and Sustainable Development 2022-2023, commemorating Azadi Ka Amrit Mahotsav, nation celebrating 76 years of independence, United Nations Sustainable Development Goals 2015 to 2030 as part of awareness and campaigns in collaboration with Sri Holistic Health Foundation India and Sri Research Institute, Center for Arts, Sciences and Wellbeing. Before we start our sessions, let's take the blessings of Almighty.
कुरुत्वं कल्याणम् आरोग्यं धनसम्पदः शुभं कुरुत्वं कल्याणम् आरोग्यं धनसम्पदः शत्रुबुद्धिविनाशाय दीपज्योतिर्नमोऽस्तुते दीपज्योतिर्नमोऽस्तुते शुभं कुरुत्वं कल्याणम् आरोग्यं धनसम्पदः शुभं कुरुत्वं कल्याणम् आरोग्यं धनसम्पदः
With the blessings of Almighty, we shall continue with today's commemorations. Today, we are celebrating an important day and commemorating International Day to End Impunity for Crimes Against Journalists, which is commemorated every year on 2nd November. Violence against journalists, the integrity of elections, and the role of public leadership. Ending impunity for crimes against journalists is one of the most important complex challenges of recent times. It is an essential precondition to guarantee freedom of expression and access to information for all citizens. The 2023 observation seeks to raise awareness of the main challenges faced by journalists and communication in the exercise of their profession and to warn of the escalation of violence and repression against them. These include attacks and restriction on the press in the context of coverage of social protest and the use of judicial mechanisms against journalists for reasons related to their journalist work on matters of public interest and the increase of forced exile of journalism in some countries. So this year's theme also seeks to give visibility to the role of a safe and free press in ensuring the integrity of elections and our democratic systems. It reaffirms the obligation of states to adopt effective measures to protect the independent press and strengthen institutional framework that combat violence and impunity and promote media independence, sustainability, and diversity. So, as per UNESCO 2022, 117 journalists were killed in 2020, 2021 across the world. In 2020 and 2021, Latin America and the Caribbean accounted for 38% of killings, followed by Asia and the Pacific with the 32% of the killings. Only 14% of the cases of crime against journalists are currently considered judicially resolved. In 2021, the percentage of women among all journalists killed among almost doubled, rising to 11% from 6% of the previous year. So Latin America, impunity for attacks on journalists have been a chilling effect on the society. Latin America and the Caribbean continues to be the region with higher number of murders of journalists, according to the 2022 UNESCO's Director General report on the safety of journalists and the danger of impunity. Since 1993, more than 1,600 journalists have been killed for reporting the news and bringing information to the public. In the 9 out of 10 cases, the killers go unpunished. According to the UNESCO Observatory of Killed Journalists, impunity leads to more killings and is often a symptom of worsening conflict and the breakdown of law and judicial systems. While killings are the most extreme form of media censorship, journalists are also subject to countries' threats ranging from kidnapping, torture, and other physical attacks to harassment, particularly in the digital sphere. Threats of violence and attacks against journalists, in particular, create a climate of fear for the media professionals, impeding the free circulation of information, opinions, and ideas for all citizens. Women journalists are particularly impacted by threats and attacks, notably by those made online. According to UNESCO's discussion on paper, the chilling global trends in online violence against the journalists, 73% of the women journalists surveyed said that they have been threatened, intimidated, and insulted online in connection with the work. In many cases, threats of violence and attacks against journalists are not properly investigated. This impunity emboldens the perpetrators, the crimes, and at the same time has a chilling effect on society, including journalists themselves. UNESCO is concerned with impunity damages whole societies by covering up serious human rights abuses, corruption, and crime. On the other hand, justice systems that vigorously investigate all threats of violence against journalists send a powerful message that society will not tolerate attacks against journalists and against the right to freedom of expression. So the UN Plan of Action on the safety of journalists and the issue of impunity is the first concerned effort within the United Nations to address the attacks and impunity of crimes against the journalists with a multi-stakeholder and holistic approach. It brings together UN bodies, UN national authorities, media, and civil society organizations. Since the plan was adopted, and the issue of safety of journalists have gained a higher visibility in the UN, as evidenced by the increasing number of declarations, resolutions, and other normative texts on the UN Secretary General's call to action for human beings. Protecting journalists is also part of 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. The plan has also contributed to building international coalitions of governments and civil society serve to bring about changes on ground, such as the creation of national safety mechanisms in at least 50 countries. But despite these achievements, challenges still exist. They use high rate of impunity for crimes against journalists, persists, and new forms of threats develop in unprecedented ways. The 10-year anniversary was a milestone to reaffirm, recommit, and reposition efforts to advance the UN plan. The United Nations General Assembly proclaimed 2nd November as the International Day to End Impunity for Crimes Against Journalists in general. Resolution 68 by 163. The resolution urged member states to implement definite measures countering the present culture of impunity. The date was chosen in commemoration of the assassination of 2 French journalists in Mali on 2nd November 2013. This landmark resolution condemns all attacks and violence against journalists and media workers. It also urges member states to do their utmost to prevent violence against journalists and media workers to ensure accountability, bring to justice perpetrators of crimes against journalists and media workers, and ensure that victims have access to appropriate remedies. It further calls upon states to promote a safe and enabling environments for journalists to perform their work independently and without undue interference. So, as the United Nations agency with a specific mandate to promote the free flow of ideas by word and image, UNESCO works to foster free, independent, and pluralistic media in print, broadcast, and online media development in this mode. enhances freedom of expression, and it contributes to peace, sustainability, poverty, eradication, and human rights. The UNESCO Director General report is a unique mechanism within the system for monitoring the killings of the journalists. It was first published in 2008. The report is submitted every 2 years to International Program for the Development of Communication, in short known as IPDC. Journalism is an essential but dangerous profession. Journalism is a fundamental for sustainable development, human rights protection, and democratic consolidation, but remains a dangerous and too often deadly profession. And 9 times out of 10, the murder of a journalist is unresolved. According to the United Nations, Education, Science, and Scientific and Cultural Organization, UNESCO's Observatory of Killed Journalists, more than 1,600 journalists have been killed since 1993. These are official statistics which have been reported, and the unreported might be many times more than the reported statistics. Other threats against journalists, online and offline, continues to grow, especially in non-conflict zones. Journalist imprisonment is at a record high, while online violence, particularly against women journalists, and harassment spurs on self-censorship and in some cases physical attacks. Journalists have also increasingly been attacked while covering protests by various actors, including both security forces and protect participants. So numerous reports and studies confirm that threats inordinately affect women journalists and who represent minority groups. UN Plan of Action on the Safety of Journalists and the Issue of Impunity, aiming to create a free and safety environment for the journalists and media workers in 2012, the United Nations developed in a participative and multi-stakeholder manner the first ever systematic global strategy to protect journalists, which brings together UN bodies, national authorities, media, and civil society organizations. The UN Plan of Action on the Safety of Journalists and the Issue of Impunity addresses the fundamental aspects of prevention, protection, and prosecution. The plan was the result of a process that began in 2010 upon the request of UNESCO's Intergovernmental Programs for the Development of Communication, IPDC. It was then endorsed by the Chief Executive Board of the United Nations and launched in Vienna on the second UN Interagency meeting on the safety of journalists in November 2012. The plan calls for a coalition-based and holistic approach to its implementation, which is coordinated by UNESCO as the UN specialized agency in the field of promotion of free flow of information. It includes 6 areas: raising awareness, standard setting, and policy making, monitoring and reporting, capacity building and research. Thousands of activities at the global and country level have taken place to implement this plan as reflected in the dedicated newsletters. The plan's 10th anniversary was a milestone to reaffirm, recommit, and reposition efforts to advance the UN plan, reaffirm the relevance of the UN Plan of Action as a blueprint of all parties involved tasked with protecting the safety of journalists, recommit political will, purpose, and resources to advance the plan's objectives, reposition to increase impact on the ground, prevent attacks, prevent journalists in danger, and hold those accountable that are responsible for attacks against journalists. The 10th anniversary have been an opportunity to take stock of its key achievements during the first decade of implementation, as well as to identify solutions to challenges that have arisen along the way. In this respect, UNESCO coordinated a multi-stakeholder consultative process involving regional and thematic consultations to collect partner experience in promoting safety of journalists. The process culminated in November 2022 when representatives of government, civil society, and the international organizations gathered at a high-level conference marking the 10th anniversary of the plan in Vienna. Austria, over 50 countries renewed their commitment to the UN Plan of Action by a political declaration complemented by pledges as well as civil societies to action. They committed to addressing new and emerging threats of the safety of journalists, media freedom, and media pluralism, such as those arising in the digital age, as well as the specific risks faced by the women journalists in relation to their work. So the impact of UN Plan of Action in the last 10 years was in three aspects: prevention, protection, and prosecution. In terms of prevention, 1,300 advocacy events organized on the safety of journalists since 2012, 6 global campaigns on the occasion of International Day to end impunity for crimes against journalists, and an SDG indicator 16.10.1 in Agenda 2020 on the safety of journalists. In terms of protection, creation of the UNESCO Observatory on killed journalists, at least 50 national protection mechanisms for the safety of journalists established since 2012, 2 regional digital platforms in Europe and Africa to monitor attacks against journalists, and over a half of dozen of national ones. In terms of prosecution, impunity rate down by 9 percentage points from 95% to 86% in 10 years. More than 30,000 judicial operators from 150 countries and more than 11,500 security forces from 1,600 countries trained on safety of journalists and freedom of expression. 500 lawyers trained in 30 countries and 1,000 cases of legal assistance provided journalists in distress over 2000 and 2021, funded by the support of the Global Media Defense Fund. So the first 10 years of the UN Plan of Action on the safety of journalists and the issue of impunity have been significant improvements in promoting a safe and enabling environment for journalists and media workers, despite shrinking press freedom, reduced public trust in professional journalism, and the disruption of media models. But the past 10 years have also seen setbacks and the emergence of the new threats to the freedom of expression and safety of journalists, which were not anticipated when the plan was first conceived. Among these are digital challenges such as digital surveillance, online violence, and cybersecurity, cybercrimes, particularly affecting women journalists, the increasing prevalence of disinformation and hate speech, and exponential growth of digital technologies, giving rise to concerns about the misuse of digital platforms and the role of internet companies in mediating freedom of expression and the safety of journalists. These challenges further include the use of strategic lawsuits against the public participation, SLAPPs, which are often aimed at journalists to prevent from the reporting on matters of public interest, or the increasing need to provide emergency assistance to journalists in both conflict and non-conflict settings. During the Universal Periodic Review under the Human Rights Council, UN member states are evaluated on their performance on freedom of expression and the safety of journalists, and have recently been provided with the tools of best practices in this regard. So strengthening and implementation of the plan in the next decade, therefore, requires addressing these emerging challenges. The United Nations, which is committed to protecting journalists, is actively working to protect journalists. This is evidenced by an increasing number of declarations, resolutions, and other normative texts. The UN Secretary General's latest report on the safety of journalists and impunity and his call to the action for human rights protecting journalists is also part of 2030 agenda for sustainable development. The Office of the UN Commissioner for Human Rights, OHCHR, is mandated to promote and protect the effective enjoyment by all of human rights, including the rights of journalists and media workers. OHCHR works to implement General Assembly and Human Rights Council mandates on the safety of journalists. The Special Rapporteur on the promotion and protection of the right to freedom of opinion and expression, is also advocate for the safety of journalists. As an UN agency with a specific mandate to promote the free flow of ideas by word and image, UNESCO works to promote the safety of journalists and combat impunity for those who attack them. This includes the training of judicial actors and security forces of international standards in freedom of expression, access to information, and safety of journalists. One of the main goals of the UN Plan of Action is to raise awareness on the importance of independent and professional journalism. International days such as World Press Freedom Day, 3rd May, and the International Day to End Impunity for Crimes Against Journalists, 2nd November, encourages discussion and analyze and promote initiatives related to freedom of press and safety of journalists and the issue of impunity. Knowing the truth is protecting the truth. So impunity for crimes has continuously decreased, though it remains unacceptably high. Impunity for the crimes committed against journalists has continuously decreased by a total of 3% since 2018, the first year of previous biannual. In 2022, the global impunity rate was measured by UNESCO at 86% compared to 89% in 2018. UNESCO therefore continues to observe an upward trend of resolved cases and worldwide from 11% to 2018 to 14% in 2022. Majority of journalists killed outside workspaces, that is up to 78%. UNESCO's data showed that there are no safe practices for journalists. 91 of the 117 journalists killed in 2020-2021 were killed while away from their offices. Most killings occurred outside their newsrooms. Some journalists were murdered in the streets or in their vehicles, and some were kidnapped to then be found dead. Several were killed in front of family members, including their children. In 2021, the percentage of women among all journalists killed almost doubled, rising to 11% from 6% previous year. Available data of 30th September 2022 showed that again 11% of the killings so far have been women journalists. Six, increase in journalists killed while covering protests. 6 journalists were killed while covering protests, riots, or demonstrations in the 2020-2021 biannual. This confirms the trend identified in the previous Directors General report, which noted a rise in the number of journalists killed in such contexts. In the 2016-2017 period, The figure for the category of killing was 3 journalists. Journalists less safe in non-conflict countries. This 2022 report confirms that the continuation of a long-term trend since 2016, whereby journalists have become less safe in countries not experiencing armed conflict than they are in conflict countries. So the key findings are 117 journalists killed in 2020-2021 by UNMA. The Binium says the lowest number of deaths of any reporting period since first publication of the report in 2008. This 2021 shows the lowest annual death toll in 14 years with 55 killings. Largest number of killings in Latin America and the Caribbean and the Asia Pacific. In 2020 and 2021, Latin America and the Caribbean accounted for 38% of killings, followed by Asia and the Pacific with 32% of the killings. Increasing states reporting on actions to improve women journalist safety. 16 states reported on actions taken to ensure the security of women journalists compared to 13 in the previous reporting period. Truth Never Dies is a campaign developed jointly by UNESCO and DDB Paris to commemorate the International Day to End Impunity for Crimes Against Journalists on 2nd November. Help keep the investigation of killed journalists alive and perpetuate their legacy by sharing their articles and stories. Let's see few journalists. Ahmed Hussein Soule, he was Ghanaian investigative journalist. He was shot 3 times in his vehicle by unidentified men on motorbikes in 2019. Daphne Caruana Galizia, she is a Maltese journalist. She was killed in a car bomb attack in 2017. Despite intimidation, threats, and lawsuits, she refused to give up on sharing the truth with the public. Samim Farmers, he was an Afghani TV news reporter. He and his cameraman, Ramiz Ahmadi, were victims of a suicide bombing while reporting live from the site. James Foley, he was an American photojournalist. He was taken hostage and murdered by ISIS in Syria in 2012. His belief that the reporting was an act of moral courage gave a voice to those who didn't have one. Microslava Breach, she was a Mexican journalist. She was shot in her car, accompanied by one of her 3 children outside her home in 2017. Her high principle work shed light on the organized crime, political wrongdoings, and other abuses. Gauri Lankesh, she was an Indian journalist. She was shot to death by unknown assailants outside her home in 2017. So Pavel Shermat, he was an Belarusian journalist. He was killed by a bomb planted in his car in Kiev, Ukraine in 2016. His sharp investigative work denounced corruption, misinformation, and other abuses. Ghislaine Dupont, she was French journalist. She was kidnapped in 2013 along with her colleague Lodi Verlin and murdered while reporting in Mali. Their courage and professionalism left a footprint that cannot be erased. Claude Verlin, he was a French sound engineer. He and his colleague Ghislaine Dupont were kidnapped and murdered in 2013 while reporting in the Mali. Their courage and professionalism left a footprint that cannot be erased. Samir Kassir, he was a Lebanese journalist. He was assassinated in a car bomb in Beirut in 2005. His commitment for freedom of expression and the rule of law is still reminded. Mohammed Al-Absi, he was a Yemen journalist. He was killed by poison in 2017. His investigative coverage strived to keep power in check. Paul Rivas, he was an Ecuadorian photographer. He and his colleagues, reporter Javier Ortega and the driver Efrain Sagara, were taken hostages by an armed group and killed while reporting in Colombia. They risked their lives to know the truth. Jamal Khashoggi, he was Saudi journalist. He was killed at the consulate of Saudi Arabia in Istanbul in 2018. His relentless defense for the freedom of expression should not be forgotten. Javier Valdez, he was a Mexican journalist who was shot dead and killed by unidentified gunmen in 2017. His reporting stood up against violence and censorship. Jan Kuciak, he was a Slovakian journalist, and he and his fiancée, Martina Kusnova, was shot dead in their home in 2018. Rukia Hassan, she was a Syrian independence journalist and blogger. She was abducted and murdered by ISIS in 2014 while reporting human rights violation in the occupied city of Raqqa, Syria. Her defiance to expose extremist atrocities should never be forgotten. So many such stories. Truth never dies. End impunity, genocide. So let's watch a few videos.
The International Programme for the Development of Communication is the only intergovernmental initiative of the UN that allocates funds and sets standards to strengthen independent journalism and build up media organizations in developing countries. The IPDC is how UNESCO has boosted the development of media over the years. Over the past 40 years, following the decisions and guidelines of the Intergovernmental Council and its Bureau, the IPDCs focused on projects that target the most urgent issues facing communication development around the world. So ultimately, it helps keep journalists safe. It supports developing media in countries where this is most needed, and it protects and promotes freedom of speech and the public's access to information. How has it played out over the past 40 years? What's been the contribution of the IPDC and its council of 39 states that govern the relevant programs? Let's have a look.
The IPDC was created because one of the pillars of UNESCO is precisely communication. Article number 1 of the UNESCO's constitution. UNESCO will guarantee the free dissemination of ideas by word and image.
As the world changes, so does the IPDC. The UN's Sustainable Development Goals have helped the IPDC promote the importance of media development as being key for progress in the bigger picture of health, climate issues, justice, jobs, and more. The IPDC has mobilized about $120 million for about 2,000 initiatives across 140 developing countries and countries in transition. Every year, it supports about 70 projects. The IPDC's rapid response mechanism allows it to move quickly in tackling urgent media development needs, as seen with the Ebola epidemic in West Africa and today with COVID-19. Throughout the coronavirus pandemic, UNESCO's IPDC has supported media in developing countries by setting up information hubs to make sure that accurate information about COVID-19 is spread. The coronavirus crisis can aggravate already challenging media landscapes, particularly for local media, which can lack capacity and resources, but which serve the most vulnerable communities. Projects backed by the IPDC are responding to current pressures by getting media organizations to support each other and ramp up the use of digital resources and services.
Access to information is fundamental for democratic societies and to ensure that many different voices are heard in the media. This is especially important if we want to change the fact that women are severely underrepresented in media, both in terms of decision-making and content. In today's digitalized world, we need to ensure that the online environment is rights-based approached, open, accessible, and multi-stakeholder driven.
As the events of recent months have shown, journalists and information professionals deserve our thanks. They are on the front line when it comes to covering the pandemic. They play an essential role in distinguishing between rumors and reliable information. In the next few years, the program will continue to play its role in defending freedom of expression and ensuring access to information so we can rise to the challenges of the future. This is why, to celebrate the program's anniversary, UNESCO calls on all of its partners, all of you, to keep up your commitment to the IPDC. Thank you very much.
Every day, free journalists endure attacks, threats, economic pressures, harassment, prosecution, arbitrary trials or detentions for exposing the truth. Too often, attacks go unpunished. Too often, they are left alone on a court's bench or a cell. The lack of strong legal protection put journalists' life at risk. The result? Those who hide the truth succeed in silencing those who uncover it. The Global Media Defense Fund enhanced media freedom by bolstering journalists' legal defense, partnering with NGOs specialized on legal protection from all around the world. The fund kicked off in 2020 as a result of the Global Campaign for Media Freedom, administered by UNESCO, and thanks to the initial major donations of the United Kingdom and Canada. The fund takes forward the UN Plan of Action on the Safety of Journalists with a specific aim of improving the access of journalists to specialized legal assistance, supporting investigative journalists to tackle impunity for crimes against journalists and enhance their safety, and fostering strategic litigations, including within a regional and international courts. The Global Media Defense Fund supports and seeks joint action with specialized partners, including renowned international legal experts, a civil society and media networks, UN partners, and specialized grassroots organizations from all around the globe in all regions, mostly from the Global South. The Global Media Defense Fund also complements and supports UNESCO's action to protect journalists and promote press freedom. Join the fund to support the protection of journalists on the ground, the right to legal assistance and rule of law, and the fight against impunity.
When you're covering humanitarian crisis, journalistic information is often a matter of life and death.
Between 2010 and 2019, close to 900 journalists were killed because they're journalists.
Around the world, the COVID pandemic gave an excuse to crack down on press freedom.
Journalism doesn't have the revenues that it needs to do the kind of serious journalism, investigative reporting that is necessary.
Lies, laced with anger and hate, spread faster and further than facts.
Y reportes como el reporte de UNESCO ponen la lupa en el lugar que corresponde. Muestran que lo que puede parecer normal en una sociedad que no protege la libertad de expresión, en realidad no es normal.
We can be optimistic about the future of journalism because more and more people are realizing how important it is.
Freedom of expression is a fundamental human right, essential to upholding the rule of law and fostering democratic societies. In many countries, journalists are being threatened, attacked, and sometimes murdered for bringing essential information to the public, uncovering corruption and trafficking. Many of the attacks happen when journalists are covering protests, public demonstrations, and elections, and when police officers are trying to maintain the public order. Attacks against journalists create a climate of fear for them, impeding the free circulation of information. This is even more critical during electoral periods because it prevents citizens from making an informed choice. From January 2019 to June 2022, 759 attacks against journalists took place in the context of at least 89 elections. 42% of them were committed by law enforcement agents.
أثناء تغطيتنا للأحداث الاحتجاجية يوم 11 جويلية 2014 تعرضنا لأحداث بالعنف من طرف قوات الأمن. الحكاية هذه خلفتني كما عقدة في العمل نتاعي.
When the attacks are perpetrated by those who have the duty to protect, the role of law enforcement is questioned. Improving the relationship between journalists and security forces is a critical part of promoting freedom of expression and ensuring that crimes against journalists do not go unpunished. Transparent law enforcement institutions which respect freedom of expression and the right to information promote accountability and are also essential for the rule of law. That is why a new type of dialogue between security forces and journalists, while keeping their independence, is needed for the common good of societies. Since 2013, UNESCO and its partners have trained over 11,500 law enforcement officials worldwide. The workshops typically involve practical exercises with police and journalists in real-life situations where tensions may arise, such as demonstrations, riots, and public events where journalists are often targeted. During the training, police officers are taught good practices, including establishing media perimeters, providing real-time information to inform the public, and building trustworthy relations with the media. As part of the workshops, journalists also come face-to-face with the police to encourage dialogue, trust, and understanding of their respective roles. The training includes various scenarios and role-playing exercises to prepare law enforcement officials on how to deal with the media during press conferences, crime scenes, and events related to elections.
Estos espacios ayudan para llegar a puntos en conjunto o de acuerdo entre lo que sucede positivo y negativo entre ambos lados, entre la policía, la fuerza pública y nosotros los periodistas.
Son excelentemente estas herramientas que hemos obtenido porque nos ha empleado la visión de cómo en realidad enfrentar algunas situaciones que a veces tenemos al trabajar con los periodistas en la prensa y cómo podemos trabajar en equipo para llevar cada uno nuestro trabajo.
Et exactement comme une thérapie, on est sorti de là en se disant que non, finalement, il n'y a pas forcément un méchant dans l'histoire.
Building bridges between journalists and security officers not only promotes freedom of expression, but carves a path towards more peaceful societies.
Imagine a world without media freedom. A world where those in power can get away with corruption. A world where the public is continuously exposed to lies, biased information, and disinformation. A world where no one reports on human rights violations. A world where crime and wrongdoings are never put under the spotlight. We need independent journalists to uphold human rights, realize citizens' right to know, and keep those in power accountable. When this doesn't happen, the loss is for all of us. Some time ago, a newspaper journalist investigated a story about a decline in organ transplant in his country. Digging deeper, he discovered that between 2013 and 2015, the National Air Force did not transport 153 organs. Instead, it prioritized 716 flights for government officials during this same period. The article led to a public outcry. This forced the country's president to verify claims and issue a decree prescribing that at least one of the Air Force's aircraft had to be on standby to transport a patient or organs for transplant at any time. In the 2 years following this decision, 476 organs were transported. Through the actions of an investigative journalist and independent media, human lives were saved. This is just one example among many in which evidence-based reporting responded to social problems and triggered positive changes. Think of it, and you'll probably recall many examples where local or international media unveiled money laundering, exposed an abuse of power, or revealed a humanitarian situation. A mechanism for checks and balances needs to be in place and is vital in our society. Journalism fulfills this role by acting as a watchdog. Without it, who would demand responses from public officials and government? Who would scrutinise them? Who would empower the public with information? If journalists were not allowed to operate free of fear or favour, the world would look very different. They are key to our society and keep the powers that be in check. Governments and politicians are not the only ones who need to be held accountable. Every day, journalists pursue investigations exposing the wrongdoings and crimes of private companies and other powerful institutions and individuals. The topics are wide-ranging, from the violation of workers' rights to human trafficking, from revealing complex conflicts of interest to exposing conspiracy theories with fact-based information, from illegal exploitation of the environment to corruption and many more. Journalists still have one goal: to serve the public, to inform you. On occasion, journalists expose mistakes and manipulation from colleagues of other media. By professionally reporting on issues of public interest based on reliable and accurate information, journalists not only help bring about justice and strengthen the rule of law, but also bring people together for the common good. In the midst of an economic crisis, where people are reluctant to pay for news, along with a shift in advertising revenue to online platforms, independent journalism needs our urgent support. Without it, we risk facing news deserts and media extinction. We'll hear fewer voices and know less about our world and the world itself. That is why the universal human rights system goes to such great lengths to protect press freedom, and why international organizations such as UNESCO have developed during the last 75 years specific standards, policies and tools to protect and promote independent journalism. Governments should be held accountable, and states should enable free, independent and diverse types of media. We need empowered citizens with universal access to information. Internet companies need to be transparent about the steps they take to stamp out misinformation and support quality journalism. Like the air we breathe and the water we drink, information is a public good, and every individual needs to recognize and cherish it.
These are journalists. Your perception of them might be positive or negative, depending on your view. But have you considered that they are protecting your right to public information? The information we receive shapes our world. But imagine if those who protect our access to it are removed by people who want to prevent certain information becoming public. What world would that shape? In 2010, two young journalists working as interns for a local Mexican newspaper were sitting in a parked car outside of a mall when gunmen opened fire, killing 21-year-old Luis Carlos Santiago Orozco and severely injuring his 18-year-old colleague. The killers fled, but the operation was indicative of a drug cartel settling a score. The cartel's target was the newspaper the victims worked for because, unlike some other media agencies in the city, their newspaper had still been reporting on drug war-related crimes. However, this was the second killing of one of its journalists in 2 years, which led the newspaper to respond with a front-page editorial addressing the cartels. In it, they directly asked them what they should be publishing to avoid further death, injury, and intimidation of its staff. This is how a zone of silence begins, where reporting is no longer independent but controlled by those with power, like drug lords, corrupt officials, businessmen and politicians. A zone where people cannot access information freely because journalists feel too threatened to report the news. Crimes against journalists are not just limited to a handful of countries. They occur anywhere where the powerful and corrupt want to hide the truth. That means in almost every country, attacks against journalists are committed, including harassment, intimidation, arbitrary imprisonment, kidnappings, violent attacks, and murder. Since 1993, 1,438 journalists have been killed, but the more shocking fact is that for every 10 cases of journalists murdered, only one ends in successful prosecution of the perpetrators. These killings include those dying while reporting armed conflict, but the majority are killed in countries without armed conflict, where journalists are uncovering local stories that some would prefer hidden. In many cases, those involved in these crimes are powerful enough to obstruct investigations and justice, but in other cases, impunity comes from bottlenecks within the justice system itself. In some countries, it's due to justice systems lacking human and financial resources. In others, it's due to corruption and a lack of transparency. While in some cases, it's a lack of knowledge of good practices to investigate these crimes. This often results in the killing of a journalist just being considered a common crime that has no connection to their profession. These shortcomings in justice systems lead to cases taking many years to resolve, if at all. They represent a breakdown in security and the rule of law, which furthers a cycle of violence against journalists. And where does this lead? To the expansion of global zones of silence. Zones where only powerful people decide the news you hear. Zones which violate our freedom of expression and our collective right as a society to access information. So, how do we solve this? The way forward starts with acknowledging the complexity of these crimes and considering them as crimes against freedom of expression, not just individuals. Central to solving this issue are judicial actors, those responsible for investigating and prosecuting these crimes. Collective knowledge of how to break the cycle of impunity is required to solve the issue, and efforts are currently being made to address this. UNESCO, for instance, is offering global online training, aiming to increase the understanding of international freedom of expression standards among judicial actors and law enforcement agencies. Support is being offered to journalists for their legal battles against attacks to silence them. And investigative journalist networks are working to resolve the crimes against their fellow journalists while uncovering the stories that the perpetrators attempted to hide. But this is just a start. The solution still requires the collective efforts of member states, United Nations agencies, civil society organizations, regional human rights courts, and all judicial actors. So, if you're an actor in the judicial system, you can learn from successful prosecutions of crimes against journalists in other parts of the world and use these teachings to pursue cases in your own country. Because the best way to protect our journalists, to protect our collective rights, is not to give up on these cases, but to bring the perpetrators to justice. As always, the solution begins with awareness of the problem. So, by sharing this message, even if you feel that you're not directly involved, you are contributing to a global effort to end crimes against journalists and protecting freedom of expression and information.
Words have power. So do images. They can change lives for better or worse. But some people use messages that violate other people's rights to dignity, equality, and safety. So when does free speech become criminal hate speech? And how do we best respond to it? There's no agreed definition of hate speech. That's why in some cases, those with privilege try and discredit critics by opportunistically accusing them of hate speech. Usually, hate speech is classified as derogatory or discriminatory language towards an individual or group based on their religious beliefs, ethnicity, race, or nationality. The UN Strategy and Plan of Action on Hate Speech includes sex and gender. International law dictates that some of this speech shouldn't be protected. In other words, some can be criminalized, only when it is linked to incitement to violence, hostility, or discrimination, and to racism. Two helpful guidelines here are the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, ICCPR, and the International Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Racial Discrimination, CERD. Additionally, the United Nations Rabat Plan of Action on the Prohibition of Incitement to Hatred advises us at which point specific speech crosses the line into causing violence, hostility, or discrimination. These three instruments have helped lawmakers define and courts to assess whether speech qualifies as hate speech and what to do about it. And especially what to do when hateful expression is not directly linked to hate crimes involving incitement and/or racism. While internet companies today have to obey laws prohibiting hate speech, there is a question of how they interpret and implement these laws in practice. There is also a question of how they treat hateful content that appears to be within the law, like whether they tolerate, delete, or downgrade it. Tech companies are working to address these problems, especially after advertiser boycotts and accusations that profits are generated by allowing hate to proliferate online, while not spending serious money to combat it. But the way they treat hateful content remains vague and hidden from independent research and public scrutiny. It's unclear when or why algorithms automatically recommend, downgrade, or remove hateful content or groups. And although they use artificial intelligence to manage the issue, this doesn't sufficiently cater for the context of words and images. The risk is that news reports on hate speech are caught in the net, while coded words and images for hate are not recognized. Another problem is inaction by the companies, even though with their data they can see when hateful content begins to scale to incitement and organizing of attacks. Key strategies to address this problem? First, promoting internet transparency is key if companies are to fall in line and deliver full respect for human rights, maintaining people's dignity and safety, while legitimate expression is allowed and indeed promoted. Second, ensuring that journalists are free to report and expose hate speech, working without fear when they call out leaders and their followers who whip up anger through insulting stereotypes and memes. Third, supporting citizens through building their media and information literacy so they can recognize and respond to hate speech through critical thinking and human rights awareness. Navigating the fine line between free speech and hate speech isn't easy. But in the interests of protecting human rights for all, we can and must work together more intensively to address the problem, without silencing free expression and the benefits it has for democracy, development, and human rights.
When we vote, we're not just choosing a leader, a lawmaker, a local councillor, or between two opposite policies. We're shaping the policies that have real impact in our lives, our health, and our environment. In a democracy, there are three key groups who should ensure that citizens receive accurate information. They are the media, the political parties, and the electoral regulators. The media is expected to provide reliable and verified news to voters. Free, independent, and pluralistic media need to be able to report elections without the threat of violence or intimidation. Through their investigations and fact-checking, professional journalism uncovers electoral wrongdoings and also verifies the claims of those who want our vote. Political parties who contest the chance to govern all need to play by the rules for a fair and free electoral competition as set out by laws and democratic norms. Electoral regulators should guarantee free, fair and periodical elections, including rules for media to provide fair and balanced coverage and rules for political parties' advertisements. They should also help ensure there is freedom of expression and association during elections. Nowadays, social media has enabled increased voter engagement and opened more direct channels of communication between candidates and citizens. It has allowed for more voices to be heard, including marginalized communities. At the same time, there are challenges, like the possibility to micro-target different voters with different, even contradictory promises. Digital disinformation is produced to confuse, distract, discourage and mislead voters and disrupt the voting process, as well as to attack and discredit independent journalists. UNESCO is part of the global efforts to address these challenges by tackling the urgency for more transparency within social media platforms and encouraging them to adopt proactive policies to protect election integrity, as well as prioritize professional journalistic content over algorithms that too often recommend harmful content and disinformation. There also needs to be transparency of all online advertisements paid for by political parties and of the budget's amount spent. Addressing privacy issues such as personal data harvesting, which can lead to micro-targeting of voters with different messages. Governments and legislators need to work with internet companies to keep equipping data protection laws. Supporting the work of independent fact-checkers that investigate the veracity of statements, speculations and rumours gaining attention on the internet during elections. Ensuring that journalists can report safely and freely on electoral processes. Threats against the press are often aggravated during elections, and yet this is a moment in time when journalists really need to bring information to the public without fear. Promoting media and information literacy for all. So, for example, that universities, schools, cities, media and internet companies help to educate citizens about the critical thinking skills needed to identify and flag content that seeks to manipulate or mislead them. Developing ethical pacts in political advertising, which political parties can adhere to and refrain from promoting disinformation campaigns during elections. When information is accurate, extensive and available, our elections remain free and fair, and democracy thrives.
The legitimate limits to freedom of expression, the three-part test. Freedom of expression is a fundamental right, enshrined in Article 19 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which states that everyone has the right to freedom of opinion and expression. This right includes freedom to hold opinions without interference and to seek, receive, and impart information and ideas through any media and regardless of frontiers. This right is also an enabling right, ensuring openness, transparency, and accountability in democratic societies. However, freedom of expression is not an absolute right and may be lawfully restricted in specific and limited conditions. Under international human rights law, and specifically Article 19 of the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, or ICCPR, the three-part test determines whether a restriction on freedom of expression is legitimate. Any restriction on freedom of expression must thus be provided for by law, pursue a legitimate aim, and be necessary for a legitimate purpose. Part 1. Restrictions must be provided for by law. A restriction to freedom of expression should be provided for by a prior existing law or binding norm, adopted by competent authorities, and which is formulated with sufficient precision to enable citizens to regulate their conduct accordingly. The law or norm must therefore be clear, publicly accessible, and easily understood by everyone. Otherwise, it would risk having a chilling effect on free speech by broadening the scope of permissible restrictions. Part 2. Restrictions must pursue a legitimate aim. Article 19, paragraph 3 of the ICCPR details 4 essential grounds for restrictions. 1. Respect of the rights or reputations of others. 2. The protection of public health. 3. The protection of national security or of public order. And 4. The protection of morals. These grounds for restrictions must be narrowly framed in order to ensure compliance with international law provisions. Part 3. Restrictions must be necessary for the protection or promotion of a legitimate purpose. Restrictions should be effective, proportionate, and the least restrictive possible to achieve the legitimate end pursued. However, This criteria of necessity and proportionality is often the most complex according to international standards. Courts and other public authorities should thus consider the context in which the restriction is applied. For instance, a restriction in favor of national security might be justifiable in times of war, but not in times of peace. The three-part test sets a high standard to justify and clearly express the legitimacy of a restriction to the fundamental right to freedom of expression. In our rapidly changing digital environment, it is all the more important to reinforce the rule of law and the application of the three-part test to guarantee every citizen's right to freedom of expression and access to information. To engage and know more, visit our website and learn about UNESCO's work. The legitimate limits to freedom of expression, the Rabat Plan of Action on the Prohibition of Incitement to Hatred. Freedom of expression is a fundamental right, indispensable in democratic societies. This right is both enshrined in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, as well as in Article 19 of the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, or ICCPR, which gives everyone the right to freedom of expression, regardless of frontiers and through any media of their choice. However, freedom of expression is not an absolute right and may be lawfully restricted according to certain principles and conditions. Besides the limitations and safeguards included in Article 19, Article 20 of the ICCPR specifies that certain kinds of speech must be prohibited by law, such as propaganda for war and advocacy of national, racial, or religious hatred that incites discrimination, hostility, or violence. Incitement to hatred is such an example of unprotected speech. But how do we determine when speech becomes incitement to hatred and therefore is illegal? The United Nations Rabat Plan of Action provides a comprehensive set of factors for states to address this issue, drawing a clear line between freedom of expression and incitement to hatred and violence. Coordinated by the United Nations Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights and adopted in October 2012, the Rabat Plan of Action proposes a 6-part threshold for courts to test whether a speech may be prohibited or punished. This threshold is measured by 1. The context of incitement to hatred, which assesses if a speech is likely to incite discrimination, hostility, or violence against the target group by having a direct bearing on intent and/or causation. 2. The speaker's position or status in society in the context of the audience of the speech. 3. The intent of the speech, which distinguishes advocacy or incitement from mere distribution or circulation of material. 4. Its content or form, determining the degree to which the speech was provocative and direct, as well as the style and nature of the arguments. 5. Its extent, which determines the reach of the speech, its public nature, magnitude, and the size of its audience. And 6. The likelihood of causing harm, determining if there was a reasonable probability that the speech would successfully incite direct action against the target group. Through this 6-part threshold, national and regional courts may conduct a thorough analysis of the severity of cases of hate speech as aligned with international human rights standards. In the case where a certain type of speech is deemed unlawful, the Rabat Plan of Action advises to prioritize civil or administrative sanctions as opposed to criminal sanctions whenever possible. The Rabat Plan of Action thus represents an important step in defining state obligations to prohibit incitement to hatred, while protecting the right to freedom of expression. To engage and know more, visit our website and learn about UNESCO's work.
Imagine a world without media freedom. A world where those in power can get away with corruption. A world where the public is continuously exposed to lies, biased information, and disinformation. A world
Today, with this, we shall end the commemoration and celebration. We are to show our support for the journalists who are really putting their efforts to provide us the information. Today is also commemorated as World Ballot Day, which is a floating holiday, and the day is set by several ballot companies annually. This year it takes place on November 2, which can be traced back to 15th century, is an intricate and artistic dance that evolves in style, involves precise, light and graceful movements and gestures performed to music. World Ballot Day is a special occasion for people around the world to celebrate. It was first celebrated on October 1, 2014. So top ballot companies around the world stream live videos over 6 continents, showing their behind-the-scenes preparations, rehearsals, and dance classes. The main companies contribute to the event of the Australian ballot, the Bolshoi ballot, the Royal ballot, the National ballot of Canada, the San Francisco ballot, and the Royal Swedish ballot. The history of ballot dates back to 15th century in Italy and France. The dance was often performed by noblemen and women in royal courts. However, the early form of ballot included not only dancing, but music, poetry, decor, and costume. Known as ballot decor, the development of the celebrate form of ballot was developed by Catherine de' Medici, wife of King Henry II of France. The year 1681 witnessed the transition of ballet from the royal courts to the stage, where it incorporated the operas, especially in France in 1700s. A French ballet master revolutionized the ballet opera trend, advocating the ballet deserved to stand on its own as a recognized genre. This led to the creation of yet another form of ballet known as ballet action. This form involved expressive and dramatic movements that were used to tell stories through the dance. 19th century ballet gradually evolved as classical techniques such as pointy work and the precision of movement and turnout developed in Russia. It was during this period that the classic Swan Lake, Sleeping Beauty, and the Nutcracker were created. Today, ballet takes different styles and shapes, with the rules being a little less rigid than they were past. Costumes were based on creativity, and classical music is no longer the mandatory genre of music it is performed. It has also given life to new dance forms such as contemporary, lyrical, modern, and neoclassical dance. Today is also commemorated just a second, we'll resume in a minute. Yeah. So today is also commemorated as Be the Impact Day. In US, Pat Miller, the International Executive Director of Pure International Vegans, founded this day, and it is set aside for individuals to do something good in their community. You get to decide what to do and how you want to make a difference in your community. You can volunteer, donate, or start a project to give back to the community. Well, we all owe the world a debt of gratitude and share equal responsibility to make it a better place. So Pure International Vegans founded this day in 2020. Choosing a specific day for making an impact is an initiative that encourages everyone to make a difference in their community. By establishing a day dedicated to promoting good deeds and acts that positively influence our communities, we can motivate others to do the same in their communities all year. This day also teaches us how to execute projects by encouraging collaboration with community and school organizations to find methods to effective positive change. The initiative brings together people worldwide to collaborate and make a difference in their communities. Million lives across the globe change as a result of the focused group effort. All our actions and choices have an effect. Your impact on others is immeasurable. However, the recipient treasures it, thus there is no such thing as a small or large influence. As part of the Be the Impact campaign, your project should aim to meet people's needs. Your project would earn you consideration for the Pure International Vegans Be the Impact Awards given to the annual celebration. Let's work together to make a difference in the world, one good act at a time. Today is also commemorated as Broadcast Traffic Professionals Day and also known as National Traffic Directors Day or National Professionals Day, which is celebrated every year on November 2nd to commemorate the first ever radio broadcast in the US, which occurred on November 2, 1920. This day is celebrated to mark the landmark and acknowledge the appropriate hard working of broadcasting professionals who work behind the scenes and provide us with their services. Broadcast professionals, traffic professionals work diligently on shows, announcements, news, commercials, and talk shows to keep us entertained and engaged. And this day is celebrated to honor their hard work. Reginald Aubrey Fraser broadcasted the first known radio program in the US from his experimental station at Brant Rock on Christmas Eve in 1906. The program consisted of two musical selections, the reading of a poem and a short talk which ship wireless operators heard within several hundred miles after the conclusion of the World War I and the subsequent relaxation of radio restrictions. Many operated experimental radio stations whose range was only a few miles. The first commercial radio station was KDKA in Pittsburgh, which aired on the evening of November 2, 1920. With a broadcast of the returns of Harding Cox's presidential election, KDK broadcast and the musical programs initiated after it was a significant success, motivating others to install similar stations. By the end of 1921, a total of 8 stations were operating in the US. The years 1921 and 1922 saw a rise in the sale of radio receiving sets and of component parts required for the home construction of sets, which was followed by a large increase in the number of transmitting stations. By November 1st, 1922, 564 broadcasting stations were licensed. In 1927, Congress passed the Radio Act and set up the agency which is now called the Federal Communications Commission, FCC, which allocates wavelengths to broadcasters. Italian Guglielmo Marconi is credited with setting the world first commercial radio service in 1898, radio relies on electromagnetic waves, and it is through the process of transmitting and receiving these waves that it works. Television broadcast started in 1940s in the Northern America and Europe. Broadcasting has a rich and diverse history. Read up and make yourself aware that it has evolved till now. Spread awareness about the contribution of broadcast in progressing the world forward. Also, spread the message about broadcasting professionals who work hard to give us the best services. Appreciate broadcasting professionals for their tireless work. Lee De Forest, regarded as the father of radio broadcasting, climbed the Eiffel Tower and broadcasted a selection of music. So that's the Eiffel Tower and public radio broadcast. Pirate radio also still exists. Pirate radio, Air Caroline FM, is the biggest UK pirate station, which never really became illegal because it operated outside any jurisdiction in a boat. Radios are still popular, and 92% of American millennials encounter radio in some form during the week. Broadcasting is still popular. John Peel was a much loved broadcaster who gave exposure to nascent genres like hardcore and hip hop. He loved the song Teenage Kicks by the Undertones. Many countries have public broadcasting, and public broadcasting uses government money to broadcast television shows and radio programs, such as BBC in Britain, NHK in Japan, CBC in Canada, Akashvani and Doordarshan in India, and so on. So broadcasters have been an integral part of our lives, and they work tirelessly to provide us with their services. This day is to acknowledge and appreciate their work. Broadcasting has a rich history that evolved through time to be as it is now. This day celebrates the evolution of broadcasting and the comfort it has given us through the ages. Music is an integral part of broadcasting and is intricately intertwined with it. This day celebrates the music introduced to us through broadcasting services. Today is also commemorated as Dynamic Harmlessness Day. It is a day to remember J. Dinshaw, the founder of American Vegan Society. Dinshaw coined the term dynamic harmless, which is used by people who practice non-violence. If you ever wondered why vegans eat the way they do, this is the philosophy that led them to become vegans. So let's learn more about dynamic harmlessness and how to incorporate into your daily routine. November 2nd, the day after World Vegan Day, is Dynamic Harmless Day. After learning the benefits of sticking to a variety of plant foods and avoiding any animal products, the next step on the vegan path is to learn how to apply ahimsa in your daily life. So the Sanskrit word ahimsa, which means non-harming, is the basis for the concept of dynamic harmlessness. While the term used to have negative connotations such as thou shalt not, Mahatma Gandhi changed it to emphasize a more positive perspective of the constructive action. This is where the idea of causing the least amount of suffering comes into play, and the goal of removing as much pain, death, and harm as possible and replacing it with help, kindness, and goodwill. This is something that many vegans, including J. Dinshaw, can relate to. Dinsha was the first to introduce the concept of dynamic harmlessness to the vegan community, and Dynamic Harmlessness Day promotes the practice. Dinsha and his wife founded the American Vegan Society based on these beliefs, and he was always advocated for more positive rather than negative approach to the world, encouraging non-harm when it comes to what people eat. The American Vegan Society established a day of Dinsha's birthday to promote his ideas to others because he promoted this philosophy throughout their life. As a result, dynamic harmlessness has become a popular concept among non-violence advocates. On November 2nd, Dinsha is born in 1933, and Dinsha becomes a vegan after touring a slaughterhouse in 1957. Dinsha creates the American Vegan Society in 1960, and Dinsha passes away on June 8, 2000. So Donald Watson is called the father of veganism. While Watson was not the first to advocate for completely plant-based diet, he and his wife Dorothy invented the term vegan in 1944. So Watson began to reconsider his meat-eating habits. He became a vegetarian when he was 14 years old, making a New Year's pledge to never eat meat again. After learning that the production of milk-related items was likewise unethical, he gave up dairy products 18 years later. A vegan diet that incorporates eggs isn't technically vegan. It is also known as ovo-vegetarianism. Some vegans, however, are willing to include eggs in their diet, but that is not recommended to be completely pure vegan. Egg laying is, after all, a normal function for hens that causes no harm. So vegans annually save the lives of over 30 animals, and being vegan reduces your carbon footprint by half. So vegan helps save over 1,100 gallons of water daily. Vegans are less vulnerable to heart disease. Vegans save over 45 pounds of grain daily. So Dynamic Harmlessness Day is observed on Dinsha's birthday to honor the aspect of his legacy. It is a broad philosophy centered on actively attempting to live up to the truth and assist others, both human and non-human. It enables peoples to live in more natural and healthy lifestyle. This encompasses a wide range of topics, including good nutrition and the production of healthier foods without the use of artificial fertilizers and pesticides, exercise, and rest. So the observance helps in promoting advantages of meaningful work through collaboration rather than rivalry. It provides helpful ways to do more good, organizing events and promote a positive ahimsa message or transferring knowledge on horrors of exploiting animals. Today is also commemorated as Look for Circles in United States. A circle is a shape where all the points in the shape are equidistant from a given point, which makes the center. This day is celebrated across the country and is a day set aside to look for circles in the world around us. The day is meant to be a fun activity for kids and adults alike. In addition to bring a fun day outside, the day helps young children learn to identify shapes, which is an important part of their development. So look for Circles Day as an opportunity to take your kids out, spend time looking for circles in everyday life and in nature. Whatever your surroundings may be, very simply, a circle is a closed curve and is a shape that can be found in everyday objects and nature. A circle is a shape where all the points in shape are on the same plane and are equidistant from a single point in the middle. which is known as the center of circles. Circles may also be defined as a type of ellipse or closed curve that has two regions, an interior and an exterior. Look for the Circles Day is not only a great way to encourage children to look for the shapes in the world around them, but it is also a great day for encouraging children to pay more attention to their surroundings and appreciate the world around them. Shape recognition is an important aspect of participating in the world around us, and recognizing shapes and patterns strengthens their capacity to identify shapes and patterns in their environment, so encouraging children would benefit them. Circles are an easy shape to start with since they are one of the easiest shapes to find and identify the modern world and nature. Circles are used extensively in art as well as many cultures have used the circle to represent important values and ideas artistically. Rotation, revolution, and other circular movements are important to everyday life. And as a result, it is the circular shape can be found easily in modern life. Circles and spheres are also easily seen in nature, from the rings on the tree trunks to drops of water. Circles are important for for mobility and symbolism, as circular shapes like wheels help us to get around and circles mobilize harmony. The perfect symmetry and smooth shape of circles make them beautiful to humans. Circles can be natural or man-made, but natural circles are usually imperfect circles. A great way to help everyone look for the circles is to make circles yourself. Bake cakes and cookies, cut up cucumber and carrots, share with them with your family and friends. Get everyone in a community together for a fun game of looking for circles. Make their own rules up, like only finding perfect circles or only circles from nature, and get exploring. Head out for a long drive in your neighborhood, but make sure your route makes a perfect circle. Track your route on maps, share it on social media. So the term refers to the boundary of the line that connects the equidistant points. The whole shape is called a disk. Every line through the center of the circle is a line of reflection symmetry. So it's a most symmetric shape. The circles inside triangles are called incircles, and each of the sides is a tangent to the circle. The circle in the word encyclopedia is cycle, and the word means circle of learning. It represents the word encyclopedia. Without navigational cues, people could walk in circles forever. People naturally walk in circles. So we love the idea of making a game out of looking for circles. We think it's fun, so look for the shapes in the world around us. We think that this day is a great day to get kids outside and busy. We love that we can set up an activity and keep kids engaged and helps them grow. We love how easy and interesting it is to find circles in art and nature. We think that shape is fascinating and love spending a day celebrating. So National Cashback Day is also commemorated today in the US. So shoppers eagerly look forward to an entire day of exclusive cashback offers, bringing endless opportunities for each of us to indulge in a little retail therapy. A plethora of smart deals ensure you save every time you spend. Something for yourself. In 2020, the event was such a success, it was extended for an additional 24 hours. So take a good long look at your wish list and start planning. Today is also commemorated as National Men Make Dinner Today in US, Dinner Day in US. We are all about empowerment in whatever form it takes. That's especially true on the first Thursday in November 2nd this year, the National Men Make Dinner Day. So if you identify as a man who throw on an apron, sharpen those knife skills, and create incredible evening meals for yourself, your friends, or your family. Despite gender roles becoming less rigid in America, there are still many men who are not taught to cook and don't take the initiative or confidence to enter the kitchen and create a meal for themselves or loved one. So this day is all about giving men the strength to get in there and whip up something nice. So humans started cooking roughly about 5 lakh years ago, regardless of whether they were men, women, or child. Today is also commemorated as Project Management Day. In US, International Project Management Day is celebrated annually on the first Thursday of November. It's all about appreciating the important role project managers play in our organizations. So this year, it falls on November 2nd. Without project managers, the huge projects and companies take on will be frankly impossible to achieve. Laverne Johnson and the Lori Milhaven of the International Institute of Learning, IIL, created the day to give project managers the spotlight and appreciation they deserve. During the board meetings, directors and other important members of an organization gather around the toss ideas. These ideas often turn into small to large scale projects funded by companies and investors. These projects take weeks, months, and sometimes even years to accomplish with the help of several resources and competent teamwork. Who does the board look to help manage this possible crisis? Project managers are professionals that help keep our project goals and objectives in check. These are individuals who manage our projects and the others that are working on them. They achieve all the desired goals with the time, scope, and budget of the project using their amazing communication, organizational leadership, problem solving, and other management skills. Project management, as its disciple, originated from the engineering industry in 1950s. Before that, large projects were often handled by the engineers themselves using ad hoc approaches like Gantt charts and other informal techniques. The development of critical path method, CPM, and the program evaluation and review technique, PERT, led to the start of a new era and the streamlining of project management as a discipline on its own. And almost 2 decades later, the Project Management Institute was established in the US. Over time, several approaches and several approaches and types of project management have been developed, such as project lifecycle and lean project management. Most of these approaches can be applied across any industry, while some are more efficient in particular industries. So International Project Management Day was created in 2004, spearheaded by Laverne Johnson and Lori Milhaven and the entire team of the International Institute for learning to highlight the hard work of the project. Today is also commemorated as Traffic Directors Day. This is an opportunity to honor and celebrate the work behind the scenes of broadcasting carried out by traffic directors who make sure all the programming is well organized and flows smoothly. Traffic direction and management involve handling programming of a broadcasting station, particularly scheduling the advertisements of the channel. Traffic directors are also known as National Broadcast Traffic Professionals Day. So Traffic Directors Day is a national celebration of traffic directors in broadcasting that is celebrated on November 2nd every year. So when the date falls on weekend, the day is celebrated on following Monday. Apart from advertisements, traffic directors do rely on technology to automate their work, especially when coordinating between departments. The traffic is brought in broadcasting refers to the entire program schedule, which includes daily programs, advertisements, and public service announcements, which are all managed by using broadcast management software. Finally, with this, we shall end the commemorations for the day. Thank you, everyone, for joining us on this wonderful occasion. So we request everyone to quickly fill up the feedback form before you leave the platform. See you all tomorrow at the same time. Take care. Good night.